It's great to meet you and have you on our Fair Talk series with the Arctic Angels. I'm so excited to chat to you about all of the work that you've been doing, but also to talk about the solutions and inspire people to follow in your footsteps and the way that you've been working on your public awareness campaigns, but also as an activist. So to begin with, I just wanted to ask you about your own personal journey into kind of climate activism. How did that come about? And then I also want to know all about Fridays for Futures and what happened there.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to be in conversation with you, really excited. It's now been a few years of me being a climate justice activist. Really, at the beginning, I actually didn't think I was an activist. I thought that was a term that was like too intense, too big. I don't think I really knew what the term meant. But I think I started very progressively as a young person, around the age of 10, actually, learning about the issues around the environment, and also not yet climate at the time, but more broader environmental, and then learning about human rights. And back then I lived in the south of France, so the big issue was refugee rights. As a young person, you do what you can. I was trying to do advocacy in my school. I would try to do like library presentations, very nerdy kid, wanting to talk about bugs. And as I grew into those topics, I realized there's this issue that kept coming back around climate. And I had been taught in school that climate change was a future problem. But every time we talked about refugee rights, it was like people were starting to talk about like imminent refugee crises because of climate change. When we talk about biodiversity, people were talking about the current biodiversity issues related to climate change. And so it became apparent that climate change was going to have to be a focus. And around the time I was in high school is when the IPCC reports really started making headlines. We have 10 years kind of narrative. So I went from being interested and curious to being totally panicked and alarmed. And that shift really changed my way of being an activist. I went from, okay, we have to educate people to, okay, there's a lot of people in power who absolutely don't want to do what we need them to do. And we're going to have to go for a much more proactive, forceful in a way manner, peaceful but forceful. And that's when I switched from really thinking, let's do presentations, etc., to let's do organizing protests, let's mobilize others. We need masses. It can't be just me. I switched away from individual thinking, and I had to think, how do I join groups that bring out crowds? And I think that's really what led me eventually to Fridays for Future, and along the way to a few other smaller organizing groups.
I find this quite interesting, the way that you were talking about how you entered in through not exactly just beginning with climate, but I think that one that represents a kind of how intricate the climate issue is and how interrelated it is to everything that's going on in the world, but also from like an activist perspective, it can feel, I think, speaking to a lot of young people who feel passionately about the climate crisis, but don't necessarily identify as activists. I think now that because it's seen and it's presented correctly as this very large, multifaceted issue, it can be very difficult for people to try and even begin to get to grips with, or then feel like if you identify with an activist, then you stand on a platform and be able to explain to people what's going on. And it's very sciencey, and a lot of people would feel really uncomfortable with that. What would your guidance be there?
Yeah, I think it's important. At least one thing that I was lucky to realize early maybe is that, first of all, I didn't have to be a climate science expert to feel legitimate about talking about the need for climate action. And I think that freed me from a need to know exactly the mechanisms of climate change. Of course, it's important to have the basic understanding because you want to be educated in the way you speak about the issue, but really understanding that, especially as a young person, because this is about the rest of your life, you're very much legitimate to say, this is a problem, I want you to solve it, without you being able to articulate either fully the problem or fully the solution. So I think that is the first thing to get rid of. The other one is for me, I didn't see myself as an environmentalist initially. I think I've grown to appreciate nature and our relationship to it a lot more throughout this work. But initially, I thought of myself as a city person and not necessarily feeling like I had a relationship with nature in that way. And so I spoke like that. And I think that helped some people, especially communities who grow up in suburbs that aren't connected to nature, or like large apartment buildings that aren't connected to nature, and they don't have a place where they can. And so they appreciated the fact that I came from a very, like, I'm concerned about human health, I'm concerned about food availability, I'm concerned about conflict, and that was helpful. So I think all of that to say, a tip would be realizing what struck you and using that as your first angle. You don't have to be all the angles of climate activism. You don't have to be the person that's there and for every single kind of component, as long as you can find what worked with you so that it can work with others like you. I always joke about this, but I, for example, am not really motivated by hope and by a vision of what the better future could be, which is maybe a very dark thing to say about myself. But
I feel like it's quite Canadian. Like,
yeah,
that's more British.
I feel like that's the French in me that remained, despite my years in Canada and my Canadian citizenship.
Yeah, very European.
Exactly. Super European of me to just be angry. And that's totally what motivates me. It's the anger. The anger at the fact that people have known about this for decades and not acted. Anger at the fact that people are still getting rich off this crisis. Anger at the fact that we're not prioritizing the most vulnerable in the way they're dealing with the crisis. And so for me, that's been that. And I think my tip is really find what works for you first before thinking what's going to be popular with others, and realize that you're probably not the only one that has those same things that will work for them. So use that can be your angle, as opposed to wanting to be what you heard another activist.
Yeah. It's something that you've obviously come across a lot as an activist, but also in trying to communicate the climate issue is with people that aren't necessarily climate deniers, but they have other priorities. And also other, particularly with the older generation and the stereotypes around like youth activism of actually, and it comes back around to this like stereotype of a lack of understanding and that not really being acceptable, of not understanding how the world actually works. And it's like being a naive young person. And how did you navigate that?
Yeah, so naive of us to want breathable air. Very naive. Yeah, that definitely comes up a lot. I usually try to understand where the person is coming from, because if the person is coming from a rejection of climate action because they have a lot to lose, I approach it very differently from someone who rejects climate action because they like it's ideological or they just don't like where the idea came from. So when it's someone who, for example, works in a sector that's really closely associated to pollution, like someone that works in aviation, work at an airport, then you have to understand that they have a lot to lose from admitting that we need to transition away from these things. And so it's like, how do we approach them with compassion, and how do we tell them, I will fight by your side so that you get good opportunities in the sustainable world. And we have to be willing to actually fight with them, not just say that we're with them. And that's really important. When it comes from people who have a lot to lose because they're rich investors from somewhere else, I feel way less compassion, and I feel much more an ability to say, I'm not interested in speaking with you. And there's very much some types of people who it might not be worth our time to keep a dialogue open or keep answering back because they're not acting in good faith. But there's a lot of people for whom I heard someone say this, and I wish I could remember who said it because I wanted to quote them accurately. Someone said recently, a lot of people are still more afraid of climate solutions than they are of climate change. And I think as a movement, when we understand that, we understand we have a lot of work to do to explain and illustrate and make sure that climate solutions are actually acceptable to most people. Because we know climate change isn't, but climate solutions can be scary if they're just about more carbon taxes and no improvements to social services. I understand why people would be afraid of them. So we have to make sure that transition is fair.
Yeah, we've seen this recently in the UK as well, of kind of a big rejection of kind of climate activism like Just Stop Oil, with then arguments about the cost of living, and actually saying that it's this kind of interesting the way in which the environmentalist kind of movement has been framed as for the environment as opposed to for humanity. So it's almost like, at least in the UK, a sentiment of humanity versus the environment, which is so interesting the way that it's been framed in that sense. And I wonder how you, in your communication with kind of the general kind of public, how you overcome that misconception.
I think you're right, and I've actually been so frustrated when people before elections do polling and they say, like, which ones are these top 3 issues? And they say like, health, affordability, something else, and then they'll have climate as separate. And I'm like,
Yeah.
you think I just care about particles per million of carbon as a concept? No, I care about it because it touches my health and my food and my security. That's the reason I
Yeah.
care about carbon.
Yeah.
I never woke up one day and thought, I really hope carbon as an entity stays below one. So I think we've mistaken by asking people to choose, even on these forms. Every time we do that, it reinforces the idea that it's one or the other. And so the way I'm trying to improve, and honestly, it's work in progress because we haven't really trained ourselves to do that, really trying to make people see the connection between affordability and renewable energy being very much compatible, or climate change being unaffordable. We actually cannot afford climate change. Canada, out of our places, just lived through that. It would be maybe surprising to anyone not living in Canada that we had a whole summer of total devastation. Like, it's been really hard, but the main conversation has not been climate change. The main conversation has been more maybe even adaptation, but really we still haven't said, hey, by the way, should we phase out fossil fuels? Maybe that hasn't been the dominant narrative. So there's a bit of a disconnect between what people are feeling. Yeah, so very much making connections.
Yeah, because I was going to say Canada is being climate affected, but there are also other countries which have less contributed to the climate crisis, which have affected a lot worse. And there's part of this ignorance. I guess it's very intersectional in that there is part of this ignorance with a part of the ignorance with the rest of the world, particularly lesser economically developed countries.
Yeah.
And do you find that people in general kind of are very uncomfortable with the idea of facing up to that kind of truth?
Yeah, I think in the case of Canada, we have to be aware that the political forces are going against us in a way. Like, we have to know that the situation we're dealing with in Canada is a country that recently got very prosperous in part due to developing natural resources, and that the fossil fuel lobbyists, the fossil fuel interests, have now infiltrated every part of our government, at every level of government, and every kind of different room where there's a decision maker. Someone has ties to the fossil fuel industry. The amount of members of parliament who have like heavy investments, their own money, their own wallets are dependent on the future of this industry, not even to say the friendships and the like future board positions and whatnot. So we have to know that it's not necessarily that people aren't seeing the facts, it's that admitting the facts, as you were saying, like, facing it would be really costly to a lot of people in terms of what it would actually mean they have to realize.
Do you think that there is a progression towards climate responsibility in this aspect? When people have the devastation that Canada has had this summer, there's a level of misinformation that you can have or that everyone can be denying. There has to be responsibility at some point.
Yeah, you're right. I think you're totally right. We're getting further and further away from like outright climate denial, and I think this summer sealed this was the last time you can do a climate denial piece. But what we've started to see now are two different branches. The branch of like total conspiracy, people are starting these fires to push a climate agenda. We've been seeing that in our media. But the dominating one, really the big one that industry is pushing, is totally climate change is an emergency, but we can't do without oil and gas. Too many people would suffer. We're going to rely on these unproven solutions. And that would be your carbon capture to produce more oil, your fossil hydrogen, which again, none of these have been proven to work. And all of these are like big gambles that, we'll figure them out in 2040 so that we can be net zero by 2050, but asking no work of the people in office now. And that's really the dominating denial that I'm seeing now.
Where do you see the solution with that specific kind of last issue, working in policy?
I think we need to remind people of the track record of this industry. This industry has lied from the very beginning. Their short-term interests are very much to make money off the situation they can profit of now. So I think we have to, of course, go out there with the facts about renewables are cheaper, are easier to deploy, are ready to deploy now, could also have a lot of side benefits like clean air, because fossil fuels, you can capture some of the emissions. But so we can go with the facts, but we also have to go with the political forces. We have to really point out that those are bad faith actors. This industry cannot be trusted. It will squeeze us out until the very end, and then it'll just vanish, not wanting accountability. And we're increasingly thinking here about how do we show their track record, because their track record really speaks for itself, but people might not be aware of it, or some people are aware of the denial campaign that happened, but perhaps not of how it's continued
People are also aware of their own consumerism
Yeah,
in that sense, in that we all consume oil
yeah,
and
yeah.
fossil fuels. And I guess I'm not letting any of these oil companies get away with any of it. I'm not excusing the behavior at all. But I think there is an element of like
Totally.
our own recognition of our kind of complicity. And even though it was not necessarily something that we were kind of knowledge, or certainly I was born post 2000, so like definitely didn't have any knowledge of, but I think that there is an element of an understanding of our kind of reliance on this and our
Yeah,
reliance on the past.
yeah,
um, and so people would be more comfortable sticking with that than
totally.
trying a new solution.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's a personal risk involved in all of this. That's why I'm not an artist myself. I'm a terrible drawer, illustrator, painter, whatever you want. But I've been trying to support and help people that do climate art, and not just like art about climate change, but like people that are like trying to paint and illustrate and design what a future could look like, so that we can start playing with the idea of what our daily lives would have to look like. For example,
Mm.
if we do need to scale back on some consumption, how do we still have good standards? And like, some of it is going to be modeling and economics, but a lot of it is going to be our imaginary. We're not maybe able to imagine things. Just like I'm sure people before the 90s would never imagine that you and I would be connecting over a digital video. Like, right? Like, someone would have had to paint this for someone to imagine. And I think it's the same way. We have to start illustrating the potential futures we could have so that we're ready to make that leap. I think facts alone won't really make us feel that
No.
courage.
And do you work with storytelling
Yeah,
a lot?
yeah, we do.
So in terms of building narratives with like collaborative narratives or just drawing them yourself?
Yeah, so for sure, trying to work more with people who do any sort of communication. And we're still quite reliant on, I guess, what you would think of the more traditional narrative building around more like text based or like illustrations. We're more leaning into video. But I think increasingly, especially, so I do work like my day job that's policy related, and then my side volunteer work that's really more around like grassroots mobilization. And in that space, I get to work increasingly with like musicians or like street theater folks who want to basically explore every tool we possibly have in the creative world to illustrate those things. And I'm really interested in what my role is as someone who understands policy. What's my role in helping those people? Because again, I'm not the creative person that's going to be able to do the actual art.
I guess when people start also ignoring the facts, it does become the responsibility of the artist to sway the public. And I want to ask you also about Arctic Angels.
Yeah.
So, what role you have been taking within the network, and how you feel that they have supported you, or hopefully have supported you, with your activism, and whether you feel that it's useful to have had a space, a kind of international space of young climate female activists leading the way. What has that kind of done for you?
Yeah, it's such a wonderful idea, right? Because it's taking a lot of folks who are doing work already around environment and climate change and all these different issues, and agreeing that we have a shared commitment to the Arctic, but that we're not all necessarily every day campaigning on the protection of the Arctic. Although all of our work leads to that, and I've really appreciated this. The network, because it's made me first of all realize the huge diversity. I don't just mean geographically, although that's been the case, but like the diversity of ways in which you can approach the problem, right? Because I've been so siloed in my very protest and organizing, and I'm getting to meet people who are doing a lot more of international diplomacy, which is something I'm not really tuned in. So learning about how they're using existing UN spaces to do work, or others who are doing a lot more of empowering other young people to do policy development. That's something that I've done less of. The first benefit for me was just discovering the amount of ways we could be activists, and people are activists, and that's been awesome. It also is really helpful when you end up going to, so example, last year I was at COP15, the biodiversity COP, not the climate COP, and it was in Montreal in Canada, and it was really great to have familiar faces, people that because otherwise it was a space that I didn't know. Being able to meet up, we met up with 4 of them who had gone, meet up, and we all went to encourage each other at our various events and press conferences and things. So just that solidarity is really meaningful in a work that can feel a bit lonely. Maybe in the last year or so, a bit less so, because climate has been talked about a lot. But in my social circles, I am still by far the most concerned about climate change, and still the climate girl. Out of all my friends, when someone will mention climate change, and everybody turn and look at me. And so it's been nice to be in spaces where everybody is that person, and you're able to go much deeper in the conversation, or able to share your doubts also. Because with my friends, I don't think I can express doubts on whether we're going to solve it, because otherwise they would all feel very demoralized. So it's been nice to have a place that you feel your values aligned, you have the same understanding of the problem, and so you can really dive deeper and rely on each other on that level.
I guess, yeah, what you were saying about what you were learning from each of them reminded me of something I've read that you wrote before, maybe said about kind of climate activism being contagious. And once you enter, I love the idea of that. And once you enter these spheres, that actually there are so many different people working in so many different, from diverse places. And so they have diverse opinions, but also diverse methods, that you then, through this collaboration, can learn so much. And it's literally just from being in these spaces that you're absorbing it. Yeah. There's really incredible about that I think is downplayed within like activist spheres, of actually the creativity of thought that is going on. Because these solutions need serious innovation. And I know that you said that you're not an incredibly optimistic or hopeful person, but what would you like to see happen in the next 10 years in an ideal world?
I think I'm not motivated by hope necessarily, or the vision of the future, but I am cautiously optimistic about where we're going. It's clear there's a lot of progress that we're going to be able to make if we keep on this track. So I'm pretty optimistic. I think for me, next 10 years are going to be quite drastic in terms of, are we, and I think I'm most focused on Canada and North America. Maybe the rest of the world has gone past that, but are we going to waste 5 to 10 years looking into magical technological solutions like carbon capture, like those things, before we realize inevitably, no, we should have transitioned to renewables and a much more circular economy a long time ago? Or are we going to make that shift quicker? I think my hope would be that we don't waste this decade, and that we actually do that right away. And at the same time, I hope that we as a movement really understand that we need this transition to be fair and equitable, and we really mean it when we really do fight side by side with people who Indigenous peoples, people who are already experiencing poverty, and they don't want to see their heating bills go up because they can't afford it right now. I hope we really start feeling the solidarity and understanding that if we can't win the climate fight without losing those other social justice ones, it just won't work. It's a strategic mistake to think we won't be able to. So I hope we as a movement embrace that and just go tackle it head on.